Imagine a country frozen in every sense of the word. In Liverpool, bodies lay unburied inside a warehouse. In central London, piles of rubbish rose several feet high in Leicester Square. Roads weren't blocked only by snow, but by the absence of anyone left to clear them. Temperatures sank to -24.6 degrees Celsius, the coldest Britain had experienced in 16 years. This was no ordinary winter. It became known as the Winter of Discontent, where the deep freeze in the streets mirrored the growing hostility between workers and the government. For those who endured it, the cold itself was not the hardest thing to bear. What hurt most was watching a nation they cared about slowly grind to a halt. And it all began quietly. The autumn of 1978 had been unusually warm, lulling many into a false sense of security. But beneath that calm surface, frustration was building. Workers were being asked to accept pay rises capped at 5%, while inflation steadily eroded their living standards. When Ford workers walked out in September and won a 17% increase, others began to question why they should settle for less. By Christmas, unrest was spreading fast. Then, on December 30th, 1978, the situation changed dramatically. Rain gave way to heavy snow as freezing air swept in from Siberia and refused to move on. By New Year's Eve, Heathrow struggled to rise above -3 degrees. Snow buried streets and rooftops, and Britain, already weakened by industrial action, now found itself battling the elements as well. The southwest suffered the worst. Snowdrifts in Devon reached 6 feet, with some areas reporting banks as high as 8 meters. Entire villages, including Ilfracombe, were cut off and could only be reached by helicopter. Major routes like the A20 between Dover and Folkestone became impassable, leaving cars abandoned for miles, half buried and silent. Under normal circumstances, the country would have managed. Snowplows and gritters would have worked overnight, and roads would have reopened by morning. But these were far from normal times. Gritter drivers were on strike, councils blamed staff shortages, and union disputes paralyzed basic services. With no one to act, the snow remained, and so did the chaos. As January progressed, the crisis turned from disruption into danger. On January 13th, parts of Scotland recorded temperatures as low as -24.6 degrees Celsius, one of the coldest readings ever in the UK. The air was so cold, it seemed to freeze your breath mid-exhale. Simply stepping outside felt brutal. Across the country, pipes burst in thousands of homes as water froze solid in underground mains. Families woke to houses without heating or running water, ice spreading across the inside of windows, thick enough to scrape away just to let light in. Many households still depended on coal fires, but deliveries had stopped entirely despite public anger. Many strikers insisted their actions were not driven by greed, but by necessity. One Liverpool gravedigger spoke of climbing into unstable, muddy grave, walls collapsing around him, risking his life for pay that barely covered basic living costs. On January 22nd, 56 gravediggers in Liverpool and Tameside walked out, most of them striking for the very first time. They had reached their limit. The consequences were immediate and shocking. People continued to die, but there was no one left to bury them. Funeral parlors filled first, then hospital mortuaries overflowed, until undertakers ran out of space completely. Liverpool City Council was forced to rent an empty electronics factory to store the dead. At its peak, around 150 bodies lay inside, sealed in heavy plastic bags with preserving chemicals, with dozens more arriving each day. Grieving families were left devastated. Proper funerals became impossible. Services were relocated away from cemeteries to avoid clashes between mourners and strikers. Families drove past burial grounds knowing their loved ones should have been laid to rest there, instead stored in a warehouse. It was deeply distressing and humiliating. Newspapers seized on the story, running dramatic headlines about corpses piling up and even the possibility of burials at sea. When health officials mentioned this as a remote scenario, if strikes dragged on for months, public fear exploded. Religious leaders and politicians condemned the situation as an assault on human dignity, warning that society itself was beginning to unravel. After 2 weeks, the gravediggers accepted a 14% pay increase. Burials resumed, but the damage was already done. This had become more than a labor dispute. It was a symbol of a nation in crisis. Other strikes soon followed. Refuse collectors walked out, and rubbish quickly filled streets nationwide. In a controversial decision, Westminster City Council dumped waste directly into Leicester Square, placing mountains of rotting black bags in the middle of London's West End. Rats thrived, the stench grew unbearable, and snow continued to fall. In some areas, ambulance crews refused to respond to emergency calls, forcing the army to intervene. Hospitals scaled back to emergency-only care. NHS staff, among the lowest-paid workers in the country, protested outside medical buildings. In one case, a health minister was deliberately denied his tea and newspaper. A small act, but one heavy with symbolism. Transport strikes worsened the situation further. Lorry drivers stopped work, fuel deliveries stalled, and supermarket shelves were stripped bare. Food spoiled before reaching stores. Farmers, unable to secure animal feed, dumped dead piglets and chickens outside union offices in protest. Each side blamed the other, and tensions only deepened. At the center of it all stood Prime Minister James Callaghan, who made a political error that proved costly. While Britain was frozen and paralyzed, he had been attending a summit in the Caribbean. When he returned and spoke to reporters, he appeared to downplay the crisis. A newspaper headline soon followed. Crisis? What crisis? Though he never actually said those words, the public perception stuck, painting him as disconnected and indifferent. By mid-January, normal life had largely collapsed. Schools shut their doors. Businesses closed. Snow-covered roads lay empty. Those who ventured out wore every layer they owned, yet still returned home shivering. Still, amid the hardship, moments of kindness emerged. Neighbors checked on one another. Strangers joined forces to dig cars out of snow. Tea was brewed wherever possible, even if snow had to be melted to make it. In the pubs that remained open, people gathered around fires, sharing stories and laughter as a quiet form of resistance against the cold. It wasn't comfort, but it was solidarity. February brought no relief at first. Powerful blizzards swept in between the 14th and 16th, bringing fierce winds, heavy snowfall, and freezing temperatures. Roads cracked under pressure, potholes appeared overnight, and coastal storms swept cars into the sea along the south coast. Despite everything, strikes continued. Finally, on February 14th, the government and unions reached an agreement. Industrial action gradually eased, but the damage was immense. Nearly 30 million working days had been lost, the economy was shaken, and public patience was gone. When the thaw arrived later that month, it felt like a release. Snow melted from rooftops, roads re-emerged, and the first unfrozen milk deliveries were greeted with cheers. Life slowly resumed, though nothing felt quite the same. Trust had been fractured. That spring, voters delivered their verdict. Margaret Thatcher and the Conservatives swept to power, while Labour, blamed for chaos and indecision, was voted out. Callaghan's government fell, and new laws dramatically reshaped trade unions, tightening strike rules and shifting the balance of power for decades to come. For those who remember it, the Winter of Discontent was never just about the freezing temperatures. It was about a sense that everything was breaking down, rubbish in the streets, bodies left unburied, cities frozen in place. But it was also about resilience, neighbors helping neighbors, strangers showing kindness, and a quiet belief that somehow the country would endure. And it did. The snow melted, the strikes ended, life carried on. Were you there? Do you remember that winter? The snow, the strikes, the feeling that it might never end. Share your memories below. What stayed with you the most from that harsh and unforgettable time?